What a privilege it is to be here. And I'm so glad. I have to say, being the inaugural speaker of the LRB series, my greatest fear was that, we'd have 20 lovely friends. And I am really utterly delighted to see that this journal, which is so important to so many of us all over the world as a site for... I actually set myself this summer to going back. I'm sure everyone in the room has this problem of back issues you haven't read from last year. And it is a completely dizzying experience to go back over the journal. So, in fact, so much so that until I have finished this book, which is not called any of those things, I've actually declared a moratorium on any further LRB reading until I'm done. Because it is such an engrossing, fascinating privilege to be a reader, let alone a contributor. And I'm utterly delighted that we've had such a good launch for this evening. So thank you so much for showing up for the LRB tonight. I have a terribly bombastic title to fill out this evening. And that isn't really the mood of what I have to say at all, to be honest. I mean, it's wide-ranging and all of those things. But like anyone else who I think is seriously engaged in trying to make sense of the present, right now I'm at my wit's end and clinging on by the skin of my teeth, it feels like, most days. And that, I think, is going to be the theme of tonight's talk. I'm struggling to make sense of the panorama that's unfolding around us, and I want to let you in on some thinking and be delighted to hear your reactions. And I want to start with a moment of bewilderment. This summer, on an extremely hot day in Chengdu, the capital of Sichuan province in China, a megalopolis of 20 million people, standing by a street corner, I was going to see the People's Park, which has the monument to the railway protection uprising that was the beginning of the Republican Revolution in China in 1911. And I was standing by the side of this multi-lane highway, and it was the pedestrian light was on red, and I got lost in my phone for a while and was looking at the map. And then I looked up, and I realized that for about 30 seconds, maybe 100 vehicles had gone past me, and I had not noticed the movement of a single vehicle. It was like one of those silent discos. There were all these cars moving, and I hadn't heard a single thing, because every single one of them was electric, and the only sound any of them was making was tire noise. And I spend my life thinking about electricity, the energy transition right now, but that was a kind of visceral moment of realizing, this is maybe what the future looks like. When a street of cars this densely packed, this isn't actually the street, and if you know your cars, you'll know they weren't these ones, because these are all internal combustion. But an entire wedge of cars and motorbikes had moved in front of me and had left me kind of lost. I hadn't noticed it had happened. It was a very disconcerting experience. And I want to start with that sense of disconcertedness, because I swear to God that I actually thought to myself, are you experiencing a moment of mid-transition? I don't know why this thought came into my head, but that's literally what came into my head. This was a fashionable idea in energy studies circles back from 2021, and it describes the condition of being in the complex period of change between two more stable states more commonly used in discussions about energy systems, gender transitions and career changes. And I kind of felt as though I was slightly in the middle of this process. You can lay it out. And it is having that effect on people. As you may know, I'm a little bit of a petrol head. And for those of us who are, the advent of this world in which hundreds of vehicles will move entirely silently is in fact profoundly disconcerting. It removes something from our lives that we're deeply attached to. So much so that the producers of electric vehicles worldwide are adding fake engine noises produced electronically to the vehicles. And my favorite motor vehicle YouTuber recently did a report on the fact that Yamaha, who were in the tuning forks business, so these people have history in musical instruments, have created a mock internal combustion engine on which the valves do not actually close. So the only function of this electrically driven engine is to generate sounds and vibrations. Why would you want the vibrations? Because it is specifically designed for straddled vehicles. In other words, you want the feeling of the engine vibrating between your thighs. This is the single purpose of this Yamaha patent, which is a real thing. I'm not kidding. This is, I think, what we mean by the mid-transition phenomenon. And then I re-entered, left the world, the blessed world of the Great Firewall behind me, and re-entered the reality of the West, and found this same story being told not in terms of the language of the mid-transition, but in a more dichotomized way, in the terms that frame my lecture this evening. Not a story about a common journey that we're on from one place to another by way of this confusing period of the mid-transition, but one of dichotomies, of electrostates on the one hand, and their others. The electrostate, to just sort of cut a long story short, is a story not just about electrification per se, but about the degree to which a society consumes its energy in electrical form. However that electricity is generated, as we know for climate stabilization, our only hope is to move as much as possible to electricity. And that then is something that we can make clean. In fact, the brilliant British think tank Ember, one of the organizations I'll come back to at the end, has mapped this helpfully onto 2 dimensions, which explains for us, on the one hand, as it were, the degree of electrification, and it's changed since 2010 along the bottom, which is what I was experiencing in Chengdu, and then the greening of the electricity sources along the vertical axis, which is where you'll find the United States as a kind of middling laggard, and the European champions of the green transition at the top, but not, crucially, making this move along the horizontal axis towards deeper electrification, the thing that I had been so taken aback by in Chengdu. And this is hardening now as an account, and it's being hardened by the fact that the electrostate is being juxtaposed quite systematically in a literature which has emerged after, and this is significant, I think, the Biden administration left office. People feel much freer, I think, to speak their minds because we're less encumbered by our desire to be polite about our friends in Washington trying to make the world a better place. And so we now speak quite openly about a contrast between the United States as a petrostate and China as the epitome of an emerging new order. All of this, of course, framed, even more dizzyingly, by the prospect of an emerging new Cold War. This is from the point of view of anyone who was committed, as I'm going to say much more about this in a minute, to the project of a democratic, progressive green energy politics, a profoundly perplexing, disturbing, dismaying reversal of the fronts. And it becomes even worse if you believe the latest crop of liberal big think policy books, if you dig into not just the question of electro versus petro, but the issue of the state, because contrasting the United States as a putative petrostate with its commitment to fracking and the power of the fossil fuel lobby with China, an emergent electrostate, presumes that at least they have in common that they have a state. And the central question of American policy discourse in the current moment is to, I think, ask the question of what that is, whether that is true, and if so, in what form. At least if you took the policy bestsellers of this year, Abundance by Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson and Dan Wang's Breakneck, at face value, the question that both of them are posing is what kind of a state apparatus, what mode of government is in fact at America's disposal at all. And you can ramify out from that a kind of mind map of a series of questions which are going to loosely frame what I have to say for the rest of this evening. Because if we start from the question of electrostate versus petrostate, there is, of course, then the question of green versus dirty. Are we in the middle of an uneven and combined transition, or Are we at the point of a great new Cold War divide? So the question of whether or not we're on a trajectory as opposed to whether or not we're in fact at a point of bifurcation. There is the question of what kind of state, but then behind that there is the question of what kind of society is it that informs the sorts of governance that are on display in the United States and China right now. And as you may know from Dan Wang's account, the contrast is between a world of governance organized around engineering and a world of governance organized by lawyers, a world of good abundance, at least to be delivered by a kind of technocratic elite, and the world of self-obstruction, as Klein and Thompson describe America's condition in the present. But there are, I think, also a variety of even deeper associations that are being organized in this juxtaposition of the electrostate and the petrostate, the engineering society and the lawyerly society. There is a question about the future and the future past. There is a question about American decline. And there is ultimately a question of how we situate the current moment within broader narratives of historical development. Can we any longer see the future or a future, or is the defining fact of our situation its rupturing of familiar narratives into incoherence, or what I've called polycrisis, and the phenomenon of hyper-agency, of exaggerated and massive moves towards land grabs on the future? Now, whenever I start running this line, which is one that you will be familiar with from me if you know any of my recent work, people always push back. And the question they ask is, well, Adam, is this really new? Is this diagnosis that you're making of a kind of peculiar type of incoherence really a novel state at all? I mean, if you remember social theory going back to the 1980s, you might ask, why are we surprised about the situation that we've ended up with? Didn't we, if not predict, then at least map out the coordinates of this confusing world, which you are now underlining as strongly as you are? Didn't we have, after all, from the 1980s onwards, a theory of a first modernity turning into something more complex, something more self-questioning, a second modernity that would give rise to a sub-politics of expert disputation and struggles precisely of the type which Klein and Thompson are now calling out as the origin of America's paralysis? Didn't we systematically decompose the old building blocks of a large-scale social science into models of actors and networks? Didn't we treat, from the 2000 onwards, even the sacred ground of the market as an ultimately malleable space subject to an extraordinary proliferation of different modes of organization? Didn't we, burrowing down into the forces of production, the layers of materiality, pose those same questions about historical alternatives? And didn't we insist forcibly on the need to tear open simple industrial determinisms that would have, in the current moment, allowed us to confidently say, here is the future, the one best way is green, and it looks like the sort of scene that I was so bedazzled by and confused by in Chengdu? Didn't we already, in the early 90s, understand that this was going to turn our simple stories of progress from the past into the future by way of a cutting edge of modernity? Didn't we understand that those narratives were going to be at least questioned, if not fundamentally thrown onto the scrap heap? And were we not already at that point confronting the possibility that even if we could agree on the mere facts, then the implotment to which history might be subjected was in fact open, contingent, framed perhaps by a set of structural necessities that linguists and literary theorists could detect, but then within the margins of this grid of possibilities, the options for a romantic narrative of the struggle of good versus evil for a positive outcome, the tragic logic of necessity, the comedic logic, this is one that's going to play quite a role in what I have to say this evening, the comedy of errors that ultimately ends in a good place, and finally, of course, the acid of satire. Didn't we already understand that those were opening up a play of options that rendered any self-confident commitment to a story of progress vain? And it wasn't for nothing, after all, that in the 1980s, in a way that was so inspiring to so many of us, that Stuart Hall mobilized his crucial concept of the conjuncture to describe precisely the kind of complex totality that I'm trying to put a pin in this evening. And didn't we, in a kind of low-key way, expect this mess that was already charted in so many ways to, in the manner of a liberal comedy, to work its way through by way, perhaps, of something you might refer to as the mid-transition to some kind of resolution? Well, my answer, I think, would be, well, yes, we did. This is certainly what we anticipated. And in fact, if you want to look for a place which in the current moment is truly broken-hearted, it is the location, it is the zone, it is the region, it is the continent, where a politics essentially derived in fundamental elements from the building blocks that I've just sketched out was in fact put into action in a way. And that is the laboratory of governance and politics that has been Europe since the 1980s, and perhaps nowhere more so than the Federal Republic of Germany. Sabel and Zeitlin, not writing about the endless possibilities of industrial production, but writing about governance in Europe, spoke in 2008 about what they called a Cambrian explosion of new types of governance that were unfolding on the continent of Europe. In Europe, I think one could really see the outlines of a kind of green modernization politics, ranging from devices like feed-in tariffs to the promotion of new green energy resources to the neoliberal devices of carbon trading, played out. And it had real effects. These are the IRENA numbers on the installation of renewable energy. And it's really worth looking at the European column here to see the way in which Europe, through the early 2010s, utterly dominated the story of the formation of a new politics of green energy. This was a place where this politics that was laid out in theoretical terms, that was sketched, the possibility of an alternative, better in its own terms, greener political economy was actually made real. And it culminated in 2019 in the EU's Green Deal, far larger in its extent in relation to the European economy than, say, the Inflation Reduction Act of the Biden administration a few years later. And not for nothing, in the fall of 2020, when Xi Jinping made his surprise announcement to the United Nations General Assembly of the truly decisive turn of Chinese policy towards decarbonization there, not by accident, when you look deep into the PowerPoint slides that accompanied Xi Jinping's announcement that were prepared by a ramified team of Chinese climate experts centered at Tsinghua University, the citation of the Green Deal by the Chinese was direct. So this is literally, I don't know, maybe it's PowerPoint that generates this particular image, but this is the highest compliment that you can be paid, I think, in modern technocracy. That is the imitation of the Chinese at Tsinghua in October 2020. An explicit acknowledgement of the indebtedness of China's vision of a comprehensive decarbonization as a social economic project to the European lead. And after all of that, after that build-up, look at Europe now. And it's really that shocking contrast that for me is the starting point of my confusion. It's precisely because something like a coherent vision of new modernizing reform governments was so clearly mobilized in Europe by this point that the current situation is as drastic and as devastating as it is. Europe drove decarbonization of power supply, but did not drive electrification. They're on the top left-hand side above the Americans, but not on the top right-hand side where the Chinese are to be found. The Germans and Italians shut down nuclear as an essential part of their politics of green modernization, but they agonizingly extended the protection for the coal sectors. They created a market for power supply through feed-in tariffs, then surrendered that market to the Chinese and then slapped on protectionism anyway. They introduced a carbon pricing mechanism that took almost 15 years to make it work. It now does work. Carbon prices in Europe are at very significant levels, sometimes above 100 euros per ton, but they were unprepared for the shock of delivering that particular price signal. Rather than focusing on new energy models, European politics and interest groups converged on the diesel, and the European car industry was milked as a source of dividends for its oligarchic investors, and they now complain about Chinese competition and demand protectionism. The Europeans were clearly at odds with both Russia and the US, and yet did nothing to develop strategic autonomy with regard to either of them. Now, of course, I'm not saying that the theorists of the 1980s and 1990s were responsible for this. They did not play the role of the European economists of the period, who do share a measure of blame for the Eurozone crisis and the truly catastrophic and widely underestimated impact that that had on renewable investment in Europe. So on the left-hand side, the ramp up, you see the formation period of this, what I'm calling this new synthesis of green governance in Europe, through to the maximum level of investment in 2011 at $131 billion. And then you see in the wake of the Eurozone crisis, which of course dramatically affected Southern Europe, where unsurprisingly the investment in solar was particularly dramatic. As that crisis hits under the sign of austerity, the European push collapses, and this is the moment of China's overtaking. But what I think can be fairly said of that group of social theorists who in some sense provided a roadmap for this, shall we say, partially successful, partly abortive project of green modernization, what can be fairly said about them, I think, is that they underestimated the question of power. They did that at home in the sense that they often failed to develop coherent theories of how the opposed interest groups might be bulldozed out of the way. And they also failed to elaborate a global geopolitics of green modernization. Now, I, for one, don't think that that necessarily follows from the kind of theoretical constructions that were offered by the range of people that I alluded to a minute ago. All Respect, for one, for instance, tried after a 9/11 to pivot to an understanding of a global risk society, but anyone who has waded through those books knows what thin gruel they are. If you read David Edgerton with his military history hat on, he is, of course, the great analyst of the warfare state. But how do we connect that to a wider theorization of technology? I think this remains a question that is left begging. Broadly speaking, it seems to me that that group of European theorists of green modernity were, in a sense, unaware of the geopolitical frame that sat so comfortably around them and allowed them to relatively easily ignore the questions which are now so painfully inescapable. And it would, of course, all have been far better if the United States had in fact been a reliable ally in the project of green modernization. And there was no, on the face of it, any reason to doubt that America might be. After all, it was in the United States from the late 1960s onwards, culminating with the extraordinary demonstration in the spring of 1970 that was Earth Day. It was in the United States that the model of modern environmentalism was first forged. It was the United States that first delivered the idea of feed-in tariffs, which the Germans then became famous for, that allowed small-scale producers of renewable energy to join the grid. It was the United States that pushed the model of emissions trading. It was the United States that created the market for the Prius. This is the global sale of Priuses, and I well remember visiting the United States at the height of the Iraq War and discovering the way in which this appetizing small Japanese car had become a symbol of resistance in Bush's America to the oil wars of the era. It is that Californian and American market that sustains the first new energy vehicle. And of course, it is the United States also that is the home, we have to say it, of Tesla and the first proof of concept of a fully battery-driven vehicle. But as we all know, that those moves towards an American green future have been repeatedly countered by backlash after backlash after backlash. It's too heartbreaking to enumerate at this point, as we are living through perhaps the most brutal to date. And there's an entire generation of historians and political scientists. I was just teaching Theodore Skocpol's extraordinary post-mortem on the failure of cap and trade in 2009-10. I was teaching that this afternoon. There's an entire generation of literature devoted to anatomizing how reactionary interest groups mobilized a culture of doubt to obstruct change in the United States. We have Quinn Slobodian's latest contribution, Hayek's Bastards, on the way in which in the 1990s green was designated as the new red. We have the strangulation of energetic municipal politics by self-interested liberal lawyers, highlighted by the likes of Klein and Thompson in the current moment. But to be honest, I find these sociologies, these sociological accounts of America's impasse too restricted and self-serving. Abundance, after all, is literally a manifesto for a better life in Brooklyn and the Bay Area. And not that there's anything wrong with that, but deriving an account of the entire United States from there seems a little like a kind of inverted pyramid. And it's a diagnosis of how we get to, its diagnosis of how we get to abundance seems to have been sponsored by interest groups who already have plenty of everything that they could possibly need. And the same is true, I think, when we reduce the political economy of American capitalism to, or fossil capitalism either, to the rearguard action of the coal industry and the Koch brothers. From the 2010s onwards, it would not have taken more than a couple of $10 billion to buy out the entire American coal industry and shut it down. That's 1/10 of the valuation of Exxon. They don't belong in the same category. I think the problem of American fossil backlash is bigger than these sectional accounts. And what I want to do in what follows is to offer an account in which that backlash is better understood as emerging from the main line of power, which centers on hegemonic efforts to maintain a grip both on American domestic society and the world economy, and disastrous exercises in hyper-agency. So if you like, a front-footed account of the resistance to the green energy project as opposed to the rearguard action of reaction and darkness and enemies of the Enlightenment. The first defection, after all, from the global green consensus happens already before the Kyoto Agreement is signed with the Byrd-Hagel resolution by the Senate in the summer of 1997. And the extraordinary thing about this is it's unanimous. And you aren't going to get a Senate resolution on unanimity as a result of the actions of climate deniers or the fringe nationalist extremists. The key element that held together the unanimity of the first wave of American backlash against global climate politics was the question of globalization. Essentially, after NAFTA and after WTO, Kyoto was a bridge too far for a very wide range of American interest groups, including the AFL-CIO, which squarely declared itself against Kyoto, because what was in the background of Kyoto was China, because Kyoto, in a kind of hat tip to climate justice exempted the great emerging powers of the era from any efforts of decarbonization, and this was understood across an incredibly wide segment of American society as a disastrously dangerous concession, self-interested, of course, in the self-serving interests of American business interests, which would relocate their most damaging processes of production to China. Once you get into it, it's downright weird how little this obvious connection to the struggles over globalization, how little emphasis it receives in the literature on the American climate backlash. America saw the China threat and feared it, or rather the American political class from the late 1990s onwards were profoundly concerned about the pressures they had unleashed in American society through the extraordinary, and this is the point I want to underline, the extraordinary boldness, radicalism of the globalization project they were pursuing in the 1990s. And Bush, though of course he rejected Kyoto, fully subscribed to that globalization agenda set in motion by the Clinton team in the 1990s. The question was, however, how to manage those forces. And into that space come what I would describe as other projects of front-footed, aggressive global management, which are not simply to be best understood as rearguard actions, but as forward-moving edges of efforts to seek control over the world. And the campaign in the Gulf, the two campaigns in the Gulf, after all, fully qualify for this badge of novelty. America's military deployments in the Gulf were not, after all, of long vintage. America certainly has projects of imperialism, but not in the Gulf. This was British territory. It's really only from the late 70s with the Carter Doctrine that the American footprint begins to build up. And I think we shouldn't estimate quite how quickly from the early 1990s onwards this project culminated. The sort of spirit that I want to invoke is the kind of deathless quote given to Susskind in 2004, in which the logic, the history-making logic of this project of power was laid out, right? This is this famous rejection of the so-called reality-based community, which defined people who believed that solutions emerge from your judicious study of discernible reality. That's not the way the world really works anymore. We're an empire now, and when we act, we create our own reality. And while you're studying that reality judiciously as you will, we'll act again, creating other new realities which you can study too. And that's how things will sort out. And there's a liberal knee-jerk in us which is just repelled by this language, by this refusal of the fact-based reality. But if you're serious about making history, this is exactly how you act. This is exactly how you act. This is the template of how you would understand the process of making change. Of course, it ends in disaster. And when you put that disaster together with the rumbles of discontent from the late 1990s onwards against the American globalization project, there is, I think, a window in the mid-2000s in which a national security coalition, a blue-green alliance, an Apollo project could perhaps have been mounted around green energy and the promise of national security in the United States. It was not to be. And it was not to be fundamentally, again, because of innovation, not because of a rearguard action by coal, but because of an absolutely transformative set of innovations within the fossil fuel sector that changed the game. And that, of course, is the story of fracking. Shale and tight oil production exploding upwards from the early 2010s answered the question of energy security through technological innovation. When we talked about alternatives to the existing fossil fuel regime, this was not what we were thinking of, but that is a set of accumulated public-private investments in technological innovation, which by the late 2000s enabled American oil men to drill for oil in ways they had never been able to drill before. The point I'm trying to emphasize is that the logic of innovation, the multiplication of options, the diversification of the mode of production that once we confidently claimed as a progressive alternative to mass production came back to haunt us in a kind of unexpected, a dramatic and unexpected way. And as oil prices ramp up, and then the financial crisis of 2008 hits, the second great shock is also kind of uncomfortably close to home, because what really escalated fracking production was not simply the innovations of the era, but QE and zero interest rates. No one benefited more in American business from that epic, extraordinary period of public intervention in capital markets and money markets than the fossil bloc. If that slogan, which we all loved so much, anything we can do, we can afford, applied to green Keynesianism, it turned out to apply with even greater force to the fossil fuel lobby. What I'm warning against here is the temptation on the part of a critique to insist that fracking was a bubble, that it never made any profit, that it was a kind of capitalist delusion. But at that moment, of course, we invoke precisely the standards of constraint, which in other contexts, our own contexts, we are only too keen to overthrow. Again, another word for a bubble is a situation with multiple equilibria. And if we are in the business of anything in progressive energy politics, it's a world of multiple equilibria. In fact, we need to keep checking our biases here, because you may have noticed that a minute ago I blanked out part of the graph showing the impact of fracking on the US energy economy. Because why do we call this? Because this is the foundation of the story of the petrostate. Why do we label this the petrostate when, in fact, the most dramatic impact of fracking alongside oil was felt in gas? And in the political economy of the energy system in the 2010s, the fundamental difference between the two systems is that oil flows out into the global big pool of oil, marginally affecting oil prices in the United States. Gas, on the other hand, because it basically can't easily be moved except through pipelines, flows into the US economy and fundamentally changes the logic and the price and the cost structure of electricity generation. Fracking, ladies and gentlemen, is the story of the American electrostate in the 2010s. Because yes, America too is an electrostate. There is no modern state that is not, to some degree, an electrostate. And in the American case, what this does, and this is true to a degree also for Europe, but it's particularly dramatic in the US case, is to fundamentally rebalance the structure of power generation, even in a venue like Texas. Along the bottom, you have the green line of LNG-driven power generation. You have the squeeze being put on coal, and then the growth over the top, even in the Texan case of wind. The fact that this is not more generally celebrated as a story of the American electrostate is not to do with the fact that there isn't drama and a really rather fundamental recomposition of the sources of electric power. It's to do with the fact that the overall aggregate is barely growing. So what we're talking about in this case is a recomposition within a system. And it's a double-barreled recomposition. It's a recomposition that on the one hand has this fossil element coming from shale, and on the other hand, that very substantial wind element piling on top. What is driving wind in Texas is not, of course, any commitment to a project of green modernization there, but simply cost. What is driving the story of the energy transition in Texas is the dramatic decline in the cost of wind generation. Now, part of that is coming from the United States. Part of that is coming from Europe. But fundamentally, the bottom of the market is defined by China, and that is the orange line that you see there, sucking down from the first half of 2008 to the first half of 2022, the global cost of wind power around the world. And this is the third shock that, the second shock really, that destabilizes that European narrative of green modernization with which I started and brings me back to where I started this lecture this evening, namely China. Because it's really, I think, the fundamental and wrenching shift in the Chinese position and the Chinese energy system, which is the most basic challenge to the Western-centric vision of the energy transition that was mapped out so thoroughly by an entire cohort of theorists in the 80s and 90s. And the element of this, which in some senses is most obvious, is the bit that is captured in this graph here, or in this graph here, which shows the share of solar photovoltaic panels in the critical phase between 2006, where, as you can see, China was a relatively small player, to 2013, by which point it has an absolutely dominant 60% share of the market. At some level, this story, the story of a manufactured energy system, because that's what makes renewables so distinct from fossil fuels, is that they are generated by turbines, by photovoltaic panels, things we have to make. And China, that's really an association that is at some level, I think, obvious. Those elements have to be made, and China dominates global manufacturing in a way that no power has dominated global manufacturing since the American era of absolute hegemony in the aftermath of World War II. So China piggybacks on European subsidies. Yes, of course it does. And China systematically builds out its photovoltaic mass manufacturing capacity with the aid of small German firms which eagerly supply them with the kit. In wind, China doubles down on its strengths in heavy engineering because giant windmill blades turning in the wind require that kind of skill. China builds heavily, attempts again and again to break into the motor vehicle market, fails repeatedly, and backtracks and moves into electric vehicles instead. The story is one that really you can read off and is not in a sense particular to the green energy story. It's simply a story of Chinese manufacturing dominance across the board. This is a huge shock to the Europeans, above all, who from the 2000s onwards had imagined that their vision of a green modernity would in fact go hand in hand with a green industrialism. It's a huge shock. But to focus on China's green energy manufacturing and its exports as the key to writing the history of China, the key to writing its economic history, is to imagine that economic history fundamentally as other-directed, as directed to satisfying global markets, to meeting export demands, catering to world markets. It's to make China's economic story like that, for instance, of South Korea or to a degree of Japan. But as impressive as those exports have been, the fundamental thing to realize is what you see on the right-hand side, which is that China's exports are really the tip of the iceberg. And really from the mid-2000s onwards, after the first 4 or 5 years of the new WTO regime had worn off, the share of exports in Chinese industrial production falls dramatically from as high as 20%, which means that 80% was being done for domestic markets, down to an average of 15%, which it maintained throughout the 2010s. The fundamental driver of both Chinese growth and specifically the Chinese electrostate is not to be found here, in this other-directed bolting of China into the global manufacturing system. The core of the Chinese industrial growth logic is to be found in this utterly awesome graph, which shows the relocation of a huge 800 million people over the period from 1949 to 2019 to the cities of China, the formation of a giant new urban society organized in 19 conurbations, industrial conurbations, urban conurbations of which I was witnessing one in the mega complex of Chengdu and Chongqing with a combined population in excess of 50 million people. These 19 urban regions are thought to contain 850 million inhabitants. This is an urban world stamped out of, in many cases, brownfield sites, built fresh. My favorite statistic is that 90% of the habitations of the population of China were built since 1990. 90%. Imagine erasing all of urban America and replacing it in the space of a single generation. When we talked about alternatives to mass production in the 1980s and 1990s, I don't think we had in mind this. I don't think we had in mind that we meant by alternative an entire new version of industrialism piled on top of everything that we had experienced so far. When Ulrich Beck theorized about a second modernity to come after the industrialization and urbanization which had dominated European and American history, I don't think we reckoned with the possibility of a far larger urban and industrial civilization to be built after that first modernity transition to a second in the West, and on a far larger scale. There are 19 urban spaces in China with a population greater than 10 million people. In the United States, we barely count 2. And that system was sustained by a massive electric infrastructure, which itself was the dirtiest thing that humanity has ever done. The burning of coal on a scale literally never before witnessed. This is the fossil fuel history of our species, summarized by way of our dirtiest fossil fuel consumption, and it is no exaggeration to say that our history falls essentially into 3 phases: the prehistory, the 19th century and 20th century history of Western industrialism, and then what has happened in China, literally in the last generation. 3 phases of our species' existence in terms of our relationship to fossil fuels. This, too, is not replication. It's not the same thing over again. It's itself also, like fracking, driven by revolutionary new technologies. This is the first fleet of driverless Chinese coal trucks. No people. This is the fleet of Chinese, its awesome fleet of furnaces. So these, when you combust coal to make power, you can do it at different temperatures. To do it efficiently and cleanly, you need to burn them at either supercritical or ultra-supercritical temperatures. That's in excess of 700 degrees centigrade. The color lines you can read there. Ultra-supercritical is the state of the art, and you can see that the United States has a grand total of 1 ultra-supercritical power plant. The vast majority of China's fleet is ultra-supercritical. So they didn't just replicate Western industrialism or coal consumption. They innovated an entirely massively new model of fossil fuel consumption that was also unprecedentedly destructive. And they knew it. And this is, I think, perhaps in some senses, the most radical element that the Chinese story adds to our thinking about the current moment. It is the scale, it is the drama, it is the overturning of any simple Western conception of a sequence of modernities, and it is the absolutely stark clarity with which they steered towards the apocalypse of pollution that you see in 2013. In terms of implotments, if the Western story is a story of a comedy, in which for ages we did fossil fuel before we woke up to the reality in the 1970s that maybe the Great Acceleration was bad for humankind, and we then slowly, by some efforts, tried to sort ourselves out. The story in China, I think, is better told in formal terms as something you might describe as romance. A struggle of good development against the evil of poverty that comes at a huge price, which is essentially squarely understood and then dramatically pivoted against as the damage builds up. When we say this is an extraordinarily a radical process. It's estimated that the number of deaths due to air pollution in China in the early 2010s was running at 1.4 million people a year. In the US calculations between 1990 and the 2020s, we think 500,000 people died as a result of air pollution in the United States over a period of almost 30 years. So we're talking here of a truly violent process of transformation, which the Chinese regime, I think, it can be fairly said, deliberately opted into as a choice and then pivoted hard against. And that pivot begins in the 2010s. It is a matter widely understood of regime survival, because there's only so many times people can see their babies choking to death before you need to pivot. By the mid-2010s, the air pollution standards imposed on Chinese coal-fired power stations were actually more strenuous than those in either the United States and Europe. As unpalatable and as uncomfortable it is, we need to reckon with the fact that the cleaning up of China's first phase of dramatic hypergrowth was accompanied under the leadership of Xi Jinping by an extremely explicit commitment to environmental protection, at first on a limited scale, and then secondly on a global scale, culminating in that Chinese appropriation of Europe's vision of green modernization in 2020. The point I want to make is that this is inescapably tied up with the power project of the CCP. This is not some sort of concession to Western norms or global liberalism. This is understood as organic and essential to the project of the CCP as a historical actor and as essential to its survival as a political force and to the completion of the unification of China under the rule of the CCP. The great green power projects of the hydro world are stamped onto the face, for instance, of Tibet as a program of incorporation. And these maps recently reproduced in a remarkably uncritical way by the New York Times, which has gone full abundance on the Chinese growth story, maps the longest ultra-high voltage transmission line, a truly spectacular engineering line, which goes from the eastern zones of industrial production back to the west and to Xinjiang, into the heart of the project of power assertion by the CCP regime. There are no two ways about the logic of this in political terms. Environmentalism becomes a key element of a revived CCP project. There is no shilly-shallying, there's no kind of evasiveness that says that really this is an accommodation of some kind of Western project. No, in its scale, in its force, in the drama of the Chinese green energy build-out, we have to see, again, the front-footed, power-orientated project of the CCP at work. And that brings me to my final section, which is this issue of the Cold War, which I have somewhat slighted to date in my effort to make sense, I hope intelligibly, of the logics, the explosive logics of development, which have torn apart the herbivorous vision of green modernization, so beloved of my generation of Europeans. One crucial thing to do, I think, is to locate Western environmentalism's politics in relation to the Cold War. And that requires going back to the 1970s, to that Earth Day moment in 1970. And I think from the very beginning, it's been clear that environmentalism in the West has two faces. I'm not going to say they're Janus faced. I think they're just two separate tracks. And one is a kind of detente environmentalism, which is directed against the great acceleration, the voracious demands of industrialism and military industrialism, that was a damnation of both the houses, both the camps of the Cold War. There was a third way, a kind of Trotskyist flavor this has. Above all, of course, closely tied with the peace movement of the 1980s and the disarmament politics. And that remains a thread that runs through environmentalism all the way down to the present day. But there was also another wing of environmentalism, notably in Germany, where it's most strong in political terms, that was universalist, that was insisted on the relationship between environmentalism and that other great mission, as Sam Moyne helped us understand in the 1970s, of universal human rights, that was directed against state power in general, you could say, but more specifically against the tyrannical state power of state socialism in Eastern Europe, and that allied itself again and again with neoconservative forces. So the German Greens were the political force in Europe that lionized the Dalai Lama and that upheld the cause of Tibet throughout the 1980s and 1990s. In the 2010s, as Donald Trump is exiting the Paris Climate Accords, German Greens in Europe make common cause with conservatives, MAGA Republicans in their denunciation of the unfolding drama in Xinjiang and then the repression in Hong Kong in 2019. This is not a surprise. This affiliation between notably German green politics and the neoconservative cause is baked in. It goes all the way back. It goes all the way back to the beginning. And for European politics, as it clustered increasingly around the green issue in 2018 and 2019, after the shock of Trump, the rise of populism, the Gilets jaunes, as Ursula von der Leyen began to assemble her coalition for her ultimately successful run to the presidency of the European Commission, this became an increasingly nagging and difficult issue. And the way in which the EU resolved it is interesting, because what they laid out was a story about a threefold, a kind of meta-Ostpolitik, not a comprehensive package, but an effort to segment different zones of potential cooperation and collaboration, but also rivalry and competition with China. The partnership wing we saw expressed and was clearly recognized by the Chinese experts themselves in that back and forth between the Chinese net zero planning and the Green Deal in Europe. The economic competition was the old WTO agenda of a level playing field. But what was new and was a concession to the increasingly tense and complex relations between the West and China by 2019 was the insistence on systemic rivalry. And Europe balanced these positions, and it was possible because, on the one hand, this was a way of marking a difference to Donald Trump's regime in the 2010s that was progressively ramping up the pressure of the new Cold War. And on the other hand, Europe was in a relatively secure bubble and confident of itself. And this was, however, fundamentally shaken out of place by two developments. And the first is the defeat of Trump at the hands of Biden, which caused the Europeans to reimagine, to return as quickly as they possibly could to a vision of an Atlanticist America that would uphold the good cause of green democracy and a bloc of democracies against authoritarianism. The second, maybe I should say there are three shocks. The second great shock was, of course, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which drove Europe, well, exposed its dependence on Russian gas and drove Europe into the arm of the Americans. And then on top of that, the third shock is the sudden surge in the Chinese green energy story. This is the track of renewable energy investment around the world over the period of the most dramatic acceleration of both American and European efforts of the most recent years. So the IRA has at least 1 year in here, the European Green Deal has 1 year in here, and the reality dawning on the West in 2022, 23, and 24 was that even at maximum effort, their efforts to build out and respond to the climate crisis were dwarfed by what was going on in China. China increasingly has come in the 2020s to be the climate challenge. In emissions, it's number one. In renewable energy investment, it's number one. And in the production of green energy equipment. And to complete the story with which I began a little while ago, this is the shifting balance in the global photovoltaics industry in recent years. Remember China going from a relatively modest position to 60% of global output by the early 2010s. At this point, China's capacity for both photovoltaic production is something like 4 or 5 times the entire rest of the world put together. China currently has the capacity to churn out 1,200 gigawatts of photovoltaic panels in a single year. America's total installed solar capacity is in the order of 250 gigawatts. So China can increase America's installed capacity by a 5-fold in a single year. This is the moment where I think that the hinge, any possibility of a straightforward melding together of a green politics, a green, distinctively Western European, Western democratic green politics, the promise of an industrial future for the West in this zone, and an autonomy from China in the face of this giant global problem definitively collapses. And in the exit interviews by the key figures of the Biden administration, like Jake Sullivan, talking to Jason Bordoff, who is himself a veteran of the Obama administration, you see this perplexity echoing through. It's a long quote. He speaks at some length. But the key line here, the first is, I think it's very difficult to tell Americans or Europeans or frankly people anywhere else in the world that they don't have a role to play in the clean energy transition other than being the consumer. I think that's just a very hard argument from the point of view of democracies selling a policy over the midterm. And then third, for what we need globally, the kind of resilience capacity production deployment, just saying, well, China will take care of it is no answer. There need to be other people at the cutting edge. And it should be Americans who are there with the highest end, most effective technologies, and it's arm waving. It's as you can see from the data itself, this is the mapping of a problem. We can entirely see what Sullivan is laying out. The political logic is evident, and the inability to deliver was spectacular. And as we saw from the spending figures, barely moved the global balance, with China driving the entire story. It's hard, really, against the backdrop of that, not to see a certain consistency in the Trumpian position, which simply says, well, in that case, let's not bother. Let's just back out of this. What are we doing here? But you don't really fully taste the irony of the consequences of that kind of decision unless you move to the final, and I promise the final stage of this increasingly twisting and turning and slightly delirious story. Because one of the great sort of historical coincidences of the current moment is that the first year of the Trump second term coincides with another spectacular shock, another instance of a kind of hyper-agency, another instance of a scale shift, a dramatic shift of a type that no one really previously anticipated. And I'm talking, of course, about the story which entirely dominates the American business scene, entirely dominates the American markets in the modern period, and that is AI. The sudden shift, as Joe Weisenthal commented in a post today on Twitter, the sudden shift in the scale of spending by previously capital-light American platform businesses is just simply like nothing we have seen in decades. And if it has one common denominator, it is that this capacity is measured in hundreds of billions of dollars, and the other thing it's measured in is gigawatts. In other words, these data centers need power. And in the American pipeline of power construction, this is what it looks like. There simply isn't anything other than a little bit of gas, the green bit, and otherwise the entire pipeline is solar and wind and batteries. The shift in American capitalism is actually happening. It had begun well before the Biden administration. The basic structural shift is evident, was already evident in those Texas data that I showed you, but is now absolutely overwhelming. And how do you square this? Well, one of the things the Trump administration is doing is trying to shut this down, leaving America's AI capitalists to fantasize about reviving atomic power stations and all of the other slightly juvenile projects that they intend. And the other move is to move to the Gulf. where, of course, there is abundant energy and a huge appetite to be placed in the position of being able to purchase America's very high-end chips. But then you ask one further step. Do the Emiratis or the Saudis anticipate using their oil and gas to power the data centers which America's shift in export policy will enable them to construct? And the answer is no more than anywhere else in the world do they intend to do so. They intend to power their data centers with renewable energy. And where are they going to resource these solar panels from? China. So Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the Emirates have emerged as some of the largest buyers of Chinese solar panels with which, and this will be the only place on earth, possibly, these two things will ever actually marry and bump as those phones do. The ultra-high-end NVIDIA chips will meet ultra-cheap Chinese solar panels in the deserts of the Gulf. Meanwhile, the United States Energy Department and the Qataris are ganging up to lecture the Europeans on what they should and shouldn't not include in their climate regulations. And why does this matter? And why are the Europeans as vulnerable as they are? Because Qatar and the United States are their major non-Russian sources of gas. That European failure comes home to roost. This, to conclude, is why I feel this situation is, if not unprecedented in an abstract sense, then at least the shattering of a almost half century, 40 years of a project of modernization to which many of us in Europe, I think, feel quite profoundly committed. It's marked an entire generation of thinking and practice and lifestyles and a kind of vision of the future which is coming undone before our eyes. And it leaves me this evening, to be honest, unsure about how I should end. I've spent days trying to think about how to land this lecture, and one of my wisest friends in the end concluded that really perhaps I shouldn't try. But I'm going to try anyway, because I think we need some sort of account. I mean, the basic dilemma is that our sense of the underlying material forces driving this story has become more and more attenuated. You can make bets on interest groups, but would they really lead you to any clear pitch in this situation? It's not clear to me that they do. How do we end up in this world in which Chinese solar panels will meet American chips in the Gulf? Well, we can spell out each one of the steps now we see it, but would we have anticipated ahead of time? I'm not sure we would have. Well, you could simply place a bet in trying to think hard about the future on the sheer force of the cheap Chinese technology. Maybe this is going to be the driver. And that, I think, is for many of us at some level, our only hope in the current moment. I've been on calls with folks that are involved in this green energy business, and that has been the more or less openly articulated point of view, with all that implies. Because as much as we may want to cleave to that position, and as much sense as it makes, we shouldn't imagine that this is the world of the 1930s or the 40s, where you can join a popular front and commit yourself to the Comintern and make common cause with the CCP. Because even if you wanted to do that, you can't actually do that. That's not actually an option which is available. So how then does one position oneself in a world in which that kind of old vision of class treachery, of commitment to a kind of internationalism is not actually available except in the fantasies of bedroom tankies? How do we position ourselves? Well, to pick up on Hayden White's options, if we're cautious about comedy and romance joining the global struggle, then two other options are tragedy and satire. And to my mind, tragedy suffers from the same problem as comedy. You have to know the ending. Even in this case, it's sad and predetermined in a bad way. And of course, things do look bleak, but are we really confident about exactly how fucked up we are or how doomed we are? That seems to me almost presumptuous. To call a book doom is kind of to miss the point, because we don't really quite know how it's coming at us. Satire is, you can feel, my impulse, my natural tendency. It's a good place. It helps to keep one's spirits up. The material is endless, but also by virtue of that, it's just simply too easy. So is there a way of making the comedy position a decent one under the current circumstances? And I ask this question advisedly because obviously, especially speaking to an American audience, now myself an American in an American venue, not yet with an American accent, but nevertheless, the risks of the comedic option, the comedic narrative for Americans are obvious. It comes far too easily, it breeds complacency, it reestablishes an exceptionalism. So for my money, the minimum move to respectability is to realize that if we perhaps want to cleave to a comedic drama about the long-run potential of Chinese technology to change the world in ways we do not yet understand, to change the energy bargain in Pakistan overnight practically, or South Africa, the very least we need to do is to emphasize that in this comedy, ours is a bit part and not the starring role. We're not the love interest. This song is not about us. This is the thing that we have to underline. And so in addressing this situation constructively, my heroes, I'm really sad that Tim Sahay is not here this evening, but Jack Gross and people like that know this scene really well. My heroes are the Western observers, the European, Ember, the outfits that are around the Net Zero Industrial Policy Lab, who are accompanying this process of dramatic transformation, not from the position of panda-hugging CCP groupies, but from the position of experts who make it their job to document around the world the flow of Chinese funds in ways that I know from conversations this summer in Beijing, the Chinese themselves don't understand, to map out and describe the scale of Chinese agency in motion as it's happening, at the level of the individual investment project. This is being done down to that level, with a view to resuming the project of openness and indeterminacy and breaking open the constraints. In other words, equipping their counterparts in recipient countries, those who, contrary to Jake Sullivan, are going to be the consumers of Chinese technology, with the tools to haggle, to negotiate, to bargain, to force the Chinese to terms. This seems to me to be a position which is adequate to the moment, that addresses the drama that's going on, that does not resume the fatal, doomed, to my mind, dangerous project of a Western exceptionalism, but positions our expertise, the freedom and resources that we enjoy in compiling data like this in a constructive way. And I don't say this in the spirit of a kind of third worldist self-abnegation, or a kind of altruism or humility even, but out of a sense that this at least is a place in which one might exercise efficacy. This is a leverage, a point of leverage, and it is really to those people that this talk, this long rambling talk, is dedicated. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Adam. That was epic. I'm afraid this isn't going to be discursive at all because we only have about 10 minutes tops. So it's going to be quick fire. Please only raise your hand if you have a really good, really short question. I can see one hand raised in the middle. Maybe we'll come up with 3 hands at this point. One there.
I see the one in the middle.
Yeah, one in the middle, one slightly 3 rows behind. And I see a hand right at the very back there. Oh, no, keep going. Sorry, I saw him. Okay, sure. You're next to him. Why not?
Okay.
Go ahead.
Is it me? Okay, great. Thanks so much for that. If you could quickly talk about major lesson of the IRA and perhaps its failures, challenges, and how that should inform future energy climate policy in the United States, if there is such a thing.
Why don't we stack a couple?
Yeah, good idea. Okay, so this gentleman there, and then we'll go to the person in the middle.
And when do you want it around? 9:15?
Yeah, 10 minutes.
You focused on energy, but at no place you considered as a force what I think major changes in demographics and land and its productivity. Do these not have a role in this balance of the future?
One more? Okay, one more. The first person, so yeah, right there, if you could pass that along. Thank you.
Yes, one thing that was not mentioned is that the U.S. military is the largest consumer of fossil fuels in the world, and I'm wondering if this factor plays a part in this story you tell.
It's absolutely extraordinary, actually. The little-known clause of the Kyoto Treaty is it exempts the U.S. military from whatever commitments the U.S. make. The Americans twisted everyone's arms into accepting it at the very last moment. It was actually a matter of discussion in the United States, which points, I think, to the way in which Kyoto was so deeply entangled with American discourse about globalization. Certainly, I see, as I was trying to emphasize, there's a sort of, it's very important to stress the role of the US militarism as agent, right? If we think about the rather odd construction of American reality provided by the people who argue that it's a society run by lawyers who like constantly tie their own shoestrings together. Like if you think of like 4 different mains, finance, tech, fracking, the 4th would obviously be American militarism. And like not altogether and deeply constrained by the lawyers, at least not all the time, right? So that would be one aspect. I am acutely conscious that focusing on energy and climate is a shorthand for a dazzling array of other fundamental issues, and every ecologist that I know insists that biodiversity and pollution is in some senses, where the rubber really hits the road. This is the tragedy that in every sense is irreversible. This is where the climate change is most brutally cashed out, if you like. I mean, it's in these horrendous pictures that we saw in the last couple of days of the death of like at least 2 major coral types off Florida. And I'm very amenable to the idea that the focus on climate, which my work currently reflects so much, is itself very much an artifact of the, speaking Foucauldian terms, the governmentality of the 80s and 90s, both as project of governmentality, but also almost self-consciously as a project of governance. The centering of climate was not by accident. It's because it's the kind of ultimate nerd problem. Like it's the thing that we think we can map, and that's there's a kind of Wahlverwandtschaft, there's an elective affinity between a certain sort of liberal governmentality or technocratic governmentality and the climate problem specifically. Apart from anything else, it's the zone where the degrowth problem can most easily be shuffled off stage because you can focus on green climate, whereas when you're talking about biodiversity and loss of territory, that move is much less compelling. And on the IRA, I mean, I think the central lesson is, I mean, if you really actually want to achieve any effect, it needs to be much bigger. I mean, the IRA is a triumph of Swiss Army knife politics. This is it became a kind of standard laugh line, but Swiss Army knife is generally meant as a compliment. It's, an instrument which is doing 10 different things. But if you are ever in a situation in which you have to rely on a Swiss Army knife, you're basically in a pickle. I mean, it's also designed for use in emergencies, and the IRA is an emergency policy. It's like a desperate effort by the Biden administration to craft something highly functional to dance in a telephone booth. Like it's almost impossible. And the other thing we learned is that as a result, it's also harder to future-proof it, right? The whole idea behind the IRA was you could change enough of American society so that it will become like the Affordable Care Act, and it clearly hasn't had that effect. What you can't fault the IRA people for is the hype. Oh my God! I mean, as a PR exercise, head-turning, like mind-blowing demonstration of the credulity and the willingness of the Western world to, given half a chance, to sign up for first, the kind of positive vision, oh my God, amazing, America's going to save the planet. And then secondly, in the European case, the kind of backdraft of that is, oh God, we're so abject, we don't have a state like the Americans, we need to do better. Both things were very, very powerful and shouldn't be underestimated. Though whether post-Trump you can do that again, I think we may have burnt the boats.
I think we've got time for literally 2 more. It'd be good if one of them was a non-male question. If we can seek out a non-male question, that would be good. I see one right there.
Go for it.
Thank you.
Can you say more about India's role in all of this?
Yeah.
Okay, we'll take that. And one more raised hand. I see someone right at the back. I feel like we should let someone right at the very back ask a question.
Hello, my name is Konrad Gorski. I've come across many predictions about a shortage of rare earth minerals surfacing in the near future. Do you see such a shortage of rare earth minerals surfacing, and how would it affect the Chinese political economy and geopolitics more generally? I asked Michael Pettis this, and he said that due to demand dependency, such concerns are overblown.
Yeah, I tend to be with him. I mean, I can't help myself. There's too much of an economist in me, and so I think supply concerns. I mean, I would again ask the question: what the hell happened that we suddenly found ourselves in this kind of boys' own world of geoeconomics, where we went around the world mapping deposits of this and deposits of that, and then sort of started building these stories about supply chain blockades and so on. These are trade-offs. It's quite obvious that we could, in fact, both mine and refine almost all of the key rare earths if we wanted to domestically. To do it would require either a substantial watering down of environmental standards or a big effort to make the processes cleaner. And it's our unwillingness to do either. And the fact that there are available sacrifice zones around the world that can be used instead. So I'm with Michael on that point. India is indeed, plays a kind of fascinating role in this story because, in quantitative terms, there's a huge gap between China and India, right? It's hard to exaggerate just how large that gulf still is in terms of their physical impact, the drama of the growth. India has just overtaken the EU as an emitter. So the transition is happening, but it's not on the same path. And there's a kind of weird way in which within the politics of global climate, India's position has become both more salient in terms of actual change going forward in terms of green energy projects, but much less secure. I mean, India, it's hard to exaggerate India's importance as the anchor of the climate justice position at Rio, at Kyoto. But that depended to a high extent on their ability to hold the Chinese in line and their ability to prevent the small island states being corralled by the Europeans into a high ambition type strategy. And that Indian diplomacy really, post-Copenhagen, breaks down, and increasingly the Indians find themselves embarrassed, strong-armed, squeezed towards following the Chinese first into making commitments in Paris, or at least opening the possibility to an NDC, and then at Glasgow finally being actually willing to state a net zero path. So this isn't a zone in which India has really built substantial agency. And the Navros Dubash, who's a close friend and the great expert on China, on Indian energy policy and climate, always just says, forget it. Take climate out of the picture. This is a man who's worked in this field for his entire life, for 30 years. That is not the story for India. The story for India is essentially a story of energy and sustainable energy. That is where the conversation is. And this is despite the fact that we all know that South Asia is in the crosshairs of some of the most extreme warming. So his view is that the politics of energy in India are such that the only plausible way of working this is essentially to focus not on the energy transition, because the Indians aren't and shouldn't reasonably be expected to run down any of their existing capacity. Their per capita energy consumption is far too modest. The focus should simply be on the question of how, as rapidly as possible, to build out new capacity. And Pakistan has demonstrated what's possible with cheap Chinese imports India is going to have much more problem going down that route or go down a more expensive road. In other words, it's not a very conclusive answer to your question. It isn't so far. It's a tiger or lion, whatever, that hasn't quite roared in the way that many people were predicting.
I'm sorry, we're going to have to stop it there. But the great thing about the London Review of Books is that we have a letters page. This article will be published as an article, and you will be invited to send your questions or indeed your comments in as letters. Please do so. But for the time being, thank you, Adam. Thank you so much for coming, and see you next year.